Welcome back to JLMinute. Josh Hasten here, JNS correspondent, broadcasting from the heart of Jerusalem. I am joined by Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Alex is back on the screen in the United States on a speaking tour, also fundraising for JNS. Alex, how's everything over there in the United States?
Well, we're doing well, talking to a lot of Jews over here who are concerned about what's going on, not only in Israel, but also in the United States.
Yeah, and with that, there was a major ruling this past Friday, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, ruling against Israel. On Friday, the ICJ ordered Israel to immediately halt its operation in Rafah. The text specifically doesn't call for an end to the war, and I want to get into the nuances there of the text. It says the IDF should not partake in activities that could bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part of the Arabs there in Gaza. So on one hand, you have Israel reprimanded by the ICJ. On the other hand, there is some ambiguity there in terms of what Israel can or can't do in the view of the UN's highest court. Alex, what's your take on it?
Well, it's similar to the initial ruling that the ICJ made several months ago regarding whether or not Israel was perpetrating a genocide in Rafah. The ICJ basically trying to say, we don't like what you're doing, but at the same time, we do recognize that you're not violating international law. So we're going to give the harshest worded ruling we possibly can while allowing for ambiguity, which will essentially enable Israel to continue its operation. Israel has said that it is going to continue its operation. At the same time, allowing for European countries to look at this ruling and to interpret it the way they want to interpret it, such that if those countries want to break off diplomatic relations or economic relations with Israel, they could use this ambiguous ruling in order to be the basis for any policies that they want to take against Israel. But again, Israel said that it will fight with its fingernails if that's what it needs to do in the Gaza Strip. It will keep going until it's done, and this ruling is not going to stop the IDF from perpetrating the war inside Gaza, and particularly in Rafah.
Let's go ahead and take a look at the clip of the presiding judge there, Nawaf Salam, reading the ruling at the ICJ this past Friday.
The State of Israel shall, in conformity with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and in view of the worsening conditions of life faced by civilians in the Rafah Governorate, A, by 13 votes to 2, immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah Governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that would bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In the present circumstances, the Court is also of the view that in order to preserve evidence related to allegations of acts falling within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, Israel must take effective measures to ensure the unimpeded access to the Gaza Strip of any commission of inquiry, fact-finding mission, or other investigative body mandated by competent organs of the United Nations to investigate allegations of genocide. The Court considered that Israel must submit a report to the Court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month from the date of this order. The report so provided will then be communicated to South Africa, which shall be given the opportunity to submit to the Court its comments thereon.
Again, as you saw there, 13 votes to 2, calling on Israel to immediately halt its military offensive, but again, leaving the door open there by not calling for a complete end to the war and using the phrase there, physical destruction in whole or in part. So leaving that open for interpretation. And obviously Israel said, as you mentioned, we will go fully forward with the war, continue the operation in Rafah in order to destroy the final 4 battalions of Hamas.
Well, one of the things also that the ICJ did is it said that it was requiring Israel to provide unfettered access to various diplomats and other inspectors to come into Gaza and to be given full access to see for themselves just how Israel is perpetrating the war, essentially giving the ICJ the opportunity to micromanage the war. And one of the justices that ruled against the ruling, and there were several, there were 6 justices that voted against the ICJ's ruling, said that this would create a precedent because the ICJ really has no authority. It has no ability to come in and to tell foreign countries how to conduct their wars. This would be a precedent that the ICJ is setting, one that could enable it to give it jurisdiction over any war in the future. And of course, they're using Israel as the test case, Israel as the scapegoat in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, the ICJ certainly does not have any means to enforce any of these rulings. And as you mentioned, one of those judges by the name of Julia Sibutinde, she actually sided with some moral clarity there. I just want to read this quote to you. She said, "This directive, which could be erroneously misunderstood as mandating a unilateral ceasefire in part of Gaza, amounts to micromanaging the hostilities in Gaza by restricting Israel's ability to pursue its legitimate military objectives, while leaving its enemy, leaving Hamas, free to attack without Israel being able to respond." So it seems like you do have some moral clarity there from one of the judges, recognizing what happened on October the 7th and recognizing that Israel must go full forward and not be limited by this court in order to achieve its objectives of destroying Hamas, bringing back the hostages, and ensuring that Gaza is no longer a threat.
Well, the International Court of Justice here is basically trying to prevent Israel from doing that. They don't want Israel to defeat Hamas. They see Hamas as some kind of, it's a double game that they're playing. On the one hand, they say Hamas is a terror entity. On the other hand, they're acknowledging basically that Hamas is the Palestinian people because if they were able to separate Hamas from the Palestinian people, then what they would want Israel to do is actually to defeat Hamas and to free Hamas, free the Palestinian people from Hamas. So on the one hand, they acknowledge that Hamas is a terror organization. On the other hand, they can't really divorce Hamas from the Palestinian people, and they demonstrate exactly why Israel actually does have to go out and take out Hamas, even at the expense of some very limited collateral damage. But it's a kangaroo court there in The Hague, and trial for genocide. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's a total perversion of what the court is supposed to be there to do. It's a perversion of what the Genocide Convention is, which was established to prevent the genocide of Jews after World War II, really flipping all morality on its head, and it just continues. And I'm sure that we will see additional rulings from the International Court of Justice as the war proceeds.
Yeah, speaking of whether it's the ICJ or the ICC, Israel is already being called on to, or nations are calling on Israel to be returned to the court even today. And I'll tell you why. Israel last night took out 2 senior Hamas terrorists, and it was an Israeli airstrike, a pinpointed strike, which took out, these are 2 really terrible people, 2 major terrorists. One of them was actually a commander in Judea and Samaria who was exiled to Gaza in the Gilad Shalit deal about a decade and a half ago, and he continued on his path of terror. Last night, Israel took him out and another senior terrorist, and at the same time, there were civilian casualties. Now, Israel insists this was a pinpointed strike, and the IDF now is investigating exactly what happened, why there were civilians hurt. It could be many things. Perhaps some arms cache was in the area and went off, which caused casualties in the civilian areas there, which, of course, Hamas embeds itself time and time again in those areas. So already talked this morning about taking Israel to the court yet again.
Right, and so this is really where you see the results of the ICJ ruling. The IDF was very quick to point out that this strike was conducted in line with international law. But now every time that the IDF fires, you're going to have journalists and diplomats and politicians around the world questioning whether that specific strike was in line with international law, whether that was a violation, whether the court can censure Israel or bring it back for additional proceedings on the basis of every single individual strike. And it seems like Israel is giving into that because they've been trying to explain themselves, for each strike. And it's not a way in which a war can be conducted. This is a war. It's a very hard situation. People will die in a war. The reason why Israel's fighting a war is because Hamas crossed Israel's border, declared war on Israel, killing thousands of people, 1,200 people, injuring many more, kidnapping 250 more. It was a declaration of war. Israel is now trying to destroy the terror organization which perpetrated the most barbaric massacre in the history of the Jewish people in modern history since the Holocaust. And now every single strike that Israel takes is going to be held under a magnifying glass and scrutinized. And Israel could be brought back for additional proceedings. Unfortunately, again, Israel seems to be giving into this and explaining itself. Israel has no reason that they should need to explain themselves when they're taking out Hamas terrorists, when they're conducting anti-terror raids inside a terror hornet's nest.
Yeah, nevertheless, I was on social media this morning, especially Twitter or X, and all the anti-Israel haters going absolutely berserk over what happened last night in Rafah. Again, Israel, unfortunately, on the defensive instead of, as you said, going on the offensive in terms of what our mission is and the moral right we have to defend ourselves and go after Hamas. At the same time, let's be clear, Israel is making headway there in Rafah and Rafah. Just a brief summary here. The IDF forces released a statement that a major terror cell in Rafah, which opened fire troops, was killed. Tunnel shafts continue to be destroyed, alongside caches of weapons which are being found by the IDF. So we're moving. I don't know if you want to say full steam ahead, but we're definitely making progress in Rafah, perhaps a little bit slower than we would have hoped for as a result of the ICJ and other factors.
Well, I would say that the IDF is moving very efficiently. They're moving methodically through Rafah, and every day that they're fighting, they are further justifying the need for going into that city. I mean, you had rockets fired yesterday on Tel Aviv from Rafah. Is the first time in many months that you had rockets fired into the center of the country where most of Israel's population lives, in the Tel Aviv region. They keep finding, as you said, weapons. They keep finding tunnel shafts. They have found the bodies of hostages inside Rafah, and they have taken out top senior Hamas terrorists. So obviously, the need for going into Rafah was great. Israel is proving that day after day. And I think that there is some advantages to moving in this methodical way, moving with intelligence, being very precision guided in all of their strikes. And the entire world that wants to see how Israel is actually perpetrating a war, which is a modern marvel, and which is going to be studied in military schools moving forward. It's moving ahead very methodically, very successfully, to be honest.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we are going to win this war, and hopefully we'll have the least amount of casualties as possible. You do have, though, a case here, and we're going to play a clip here in a second, an IDF reservist who threatened mutiny if the government of Israel doesn't pursue what he defined as a complete victory over Hamas. And let's go ahead and roll that clip.
ראש הממשלה בנימין נתניהו, הסרטון הזה מיועד לך. אנחנו חיילי המילואים לא מתכוונים למסור את המפתחות לאף רשות פלסטינית, לא מתכוונים להעביר את המפתחות של עזה לאף ישות חמאס, פתח או כל ישות ערבית אחרת. חיילי המילואים מאחוריך ואנחנו רוצים לנצח. יש לנו הזדמנות של פעם בחיים. יש לך 100,000 לוחמי מילואים שמוכנים למסור נפש בשביל עם ישראל. מוכנים למות. איבדנו הכל, איבדנו את החיי משפחה שלנו, איבדנו את הפרנסה שלנו, ואין לנו לאן ללכת. אנחנו נשאר פה עד הסוף, עד הניצחון. יואב גלנט, אתה לא יכול לנצח מלחמה. תתפטר, אתה לא יכול לנצח את המלחמה. אתה לא יכול לפקד עלינו. והנה אני מודיע לך, אדון יואב גלנט, אם אנחנו לא נלך עד הניצחון, 100,000 חיילי מילואים יישארו על הגדר, לא נזוז מהגדר. אנחנו נשאר פה על הגדר, אנחנו נקרא לתושבי מדינת ישראל להגיע לעזה. ותחת הבטחה שלנו, ואנחנו נקשיב למנהיג אחד, וזה לא שר הביטחון וזה לא הרמטכ"ל, זה לראש הממשלה. תחשבו טוב טוב למי אתם מתכוונים לתת המפתחות אחרי זה. אנחנו רוצים ניצחון. האחים שלנו לא נרצחו סתם, לא נאנסו סתם ולא נשחטו במיטות שלהם סתם. אנחנו שקפצנו ב7 לאוקטובר ועד רגעים אלה נמצאים במילואים בלי לישון עם המשפחות שלנו, רוצים ניצחון, רוצים הכרעה, רוצים לפרק את מי שנשאר פה, את כל מי שחגג ששחטו אותנו, את כל הילדים הקטנים שדרכו על ראשים של האחים שלנו, החיילים כשהם דרכו על אדמת עזה. את כל אלה אנחנו רוצים להרוג. אף אחד לא יישאר חי. מי שפגע בעם ישראל, מי שפגע באחים שלנו, היהודים, הדרוזים, הבדואים, אנחנו רוצים להשמיד אותו. ואתה, אדון גלנט, לא יכול לעשות את זה. אז הנה אני מודיע לך, או שתשנה את התקליט שלך, תחליף את התקליט, ותבין שאנחנו רוצים לנצח, או שאנחנו נלך רק עם ראש הממשלה. רק מי שיחליט שאנחנו צריכים לנצח, אחריו אנחנו נלך. הנה אני אומר לך, אתם רציתם הפיכה צבאית, אנחנו חיילי המילואים שלא יכולים כבר לחזור הביתה, אנחנו נראה לכם מה זה הכרעה, אנחנו נראה לכם מה זה ניצחון, ואנחנו נראה לכם איך יהודים אמיתיים מנצחים.
So there you have it. You have an IDF reservist with his face covered, and that has gone viral over the last several days on social media. And he actually has been relieved of his duty. They discovered who it was. They figured it out. And the IDF spokesman's unit said the military advocate general has ordered an immediate police investigation, a crackdown on violations by soldiers who make similar statements as such. What can we make of this soldier? Do you think he shares the sentiment of many other soldiers? Perhaps they are not willing to come forward as he did and take the risk, risking their military career by saying things publicly like that. What do you think of that clip?
I think that the sentiments that this soldier shared are shared by many reservists. And you have to understand that reservists have, and I believe that this soldier said it in a statement, you know, they've destroyed their family lives, they've destroyed their businesses because they have left civilian life. Remember, the IDF is by and large a civilian army made up of regular people that are husbands and fathers and workers and friends. And they picked up and they have put their lives on the line to move into Gaza. The war has taken a long time. We're already in the 8th month of this war, and most of these reservists have been away from their families for at least half of that period. And they want to win. They said they are willing to put their lives on the line if they're going to change the strategic situation of Israel for the several generations into the future. However, these soldiers are basically saying that they feel like their hands are tied behind their backs. In many cases, that the rules of engagement are continuing to be tightened on them. And what's happened is that they have seen their friends get killed right next to them, oftentimes in battle, because they don't feel like they are getting the full support of everything that the IDF has to offer, and certainly not the full support of the political establishment, which many of these reservists feel are moving slower, moving with less force than they otherwise would, because they're trying to appease the Biden administration, because they're trying to appease the Western Europeans, and they're trying not to fall into harsh verdicts here in the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, like we discussed earlier. I think that those sentiments are well shared by many, many others. I'm glad that somebody said it. I'm glad it went viral. I hope that it has some kind of effect on the way the politicians conduct the war. But as you said, this soldier was sent home, and I hope that he won't be hurt in some way, with some kind of criminal proceedings in Israel, by sharing the sentiments that many soldiers share, and by basically saying that what he wants is to do the same thing that Netanyahu has said the entire time, which is to have total victory in the Gaza Strip.
Absolutely. Many, many soldiers definitely feel the same way, calling for a total victory in Gaza. Before we focus on the north, and we'll get to that in a few minutes here, but unfortunately, just before Shabbat this past week, Israel announced that IDF forces recovered the bodies of 3 more hostages in Gaza. And as Israel said, we are going to bring back all the hostages, whether they are alive or whether they are dead. This was actually a joint operation between the IDF and the Shin Bet, the Israel security forces, bringing back, unfortunately, the bodies of Orion Hernandez, Radu, Hanan, Yablona, Hanan Yabloka, and Michael Nissenbaum. Just days earlier, there were 4 other Israeli hostages whose bodies were recovered, and it's important to note that their bodies were recovered in a tunnel shaft under a UN building in the Jabaliya area, if I'm not mistaken, there in Gaza. So there you have the UN force there in Gaza, once again proving that, and I've done this many times, hashtag UNRWA is Hamas. We see once again, there's no way they can say they didn't know what was going on, didn't know what was happening right under their feet, literally right under their noses down there in Gaza. So sad news there with the recovery of 7 hostages. But that being said, Israel continues to insist, we are going to bring everyone back no matter what.
It also indicates that many of the hostages, unfortunately, are not alive. It's probably clear that many of the believed supposed hostages were killed even on October 7th, and that Hamas specifically brought their bodies back in order to inflate the number of hostages that they were believed to be holding, to give them maximum leverage over the state of Israel. And you have to believe that the IDF and the state of Israel has intelligence about how many of the hostages are alive, how many of them are dead. There's probably at this point, at best, maybe 2 to 3 dozen hostages alive left in the Gaza Strip. And so as you're seeing more and more operations that are recovering bodies, it's a very, very sad situation. Of course, it's heartbreaking for the families that have held hope that their loved ones might be alive. At the same time, it provides some degree of closure for these families, which unfortunately is necessary. And it definitely reinforces Netanyahu and the war cabinet's view that they need to continue to perpetrate the war and not to slow down, not to stop the fighting as Hamas is demanding, because there's really not that many hostages left alive.
Very, very sad indeed. At the same time, the United States continues to get involved in Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. And this reminds me of Helm. And if you're not familiar with the reference, you have to look up Helm. And I'm talking about the Gaza pier, which the United States built, spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and the goal of the pier to bring aid to the Gazans. So instead of focusing on forcing Hamas to surrender, bringing back the hostages, the U.S. spent hundreds of millions into this pier. And over the weekend, there was some sort of accident as a result of high winds. You had a piece of the pier break off, U.S. craft. Another boat apparently, I guess, went after that piece of pier, and the boat was became stuck on the coast of Ashdod, one of our coastal towns just north of Gaza. Here you had an entire day's work with IDF forces, along with the United States, trying to dig out this boat and release it so it could go back to sea. At the same time, you had several U.S. Military personnel injured, one of them in critical condition. I don't know, it wasn't explained exactly what the accident was, but one of them was critically hurt on this pier. So here you have this floating dock in the middle of the ocean here, in the middle of the sea, which is supposed to bring aid into Gaza, yet you have boats chasing the pier, which is blowing away in the wind. You have all this stuff going on right now, and I think that, the major point here is that instead of focusing on the goal, which is getting rid of Hamas, you have all these games. As I said before, look up the term Helm in building this pier and fastening this pier together. And here you have an entire day's work of this boat floating away or whatnot and landing on the shore of Ashdod, causing both armies to have to take their time and effort and money to go chasing boats instead of chasing Hamas.
Yeah, I think that the other point is that a lot of the aid that has come in via this port has been taken directly by Hamas, and there's no indication that it's being distributed widely to the Palestinian public as it's intended to do. And I think that there's been a strategic mistake here by the state of Israel to allow the United States to be the one that brings in the aid and to allow it to be distributed by NGOs and potentially by the UN. Israel should have come in on day one and said, that Palestinian sovereignty in this area is over, and the IDF is now the sovereign in this territory. And yes, the United States can participate in bringing in humanitarian aid, just as Israel is and other countries can. Of course, that all needs to be inspected to make sure that there's no weaponry in there, which obviously we've seen time and time again. There's tons of smuggling into the Gaza Strip through those 50 tunnels from Sinai into Rafah, through the Rafah border itself. However they can smuggle things in, they try to do that. So obviously you have to inspect anything that goes in. But the IDF should have said, we are the sovereign in this territory for the time being. This is an Israeli military law. It's martial law taking place. And we will be the ones that distribute the aid to the Palestinians, because that is the power that you need to express within the Strip in order for the Palestinian people there to recognize, again, who is the sovereign, who is the strong man. As long as Hamas is the ones that put their hands on that aid first, that means that they are still in charge of the Gaza Strip. The IDF and Israel should have said from day one, Hamas has no role in this Strip politically, socially, economically. The only role they have is militarily, and we're going to defeat them militarily as well. The IDF should have said, we are the ones that are in charge of this territory. And if Palestinians, you want food, you want aid, you need anything, you come to us, because we're restoring law and order in this lawless piece of land.
Yeah, until this day, you're still seeing images there of the trucks going into Gaza and Hamas members immediately hijacking the trucks and firing on those who are trying to get aid without paying the pauper, paying Hamas the jacked up prices, if you will, on the aid coming in. And that's the situation there in Gaza. And of course, as we talked about last week, Egypt still with its border basically sealed, not really helping the aid. But I want to turn to the north, because the fighting continues on the northern border. Yesterday, on Sunday, you had nearly continuous rocket strikes by Hezbollah into northern Israel. It was almost every single hour. At the same time, Israeli drone strikes in central Syria, taking out 2 Hezbollah terrorists. And then you had unconfirmed reports that Israel used for the first time ever a suicide drone, taking out a wanted terrorist, a Hezbollah terrorist, on a motorcycle in Lebanon. So you have Syria, you have Lebanon, Israel taking the fight to the terrorists in those countries. And at the same time, you still have 60+ thousand Israeli citizens who are not in their homes on the northern border. There was an Israeli injured yesterday, and nearly continuous rocket fire coming from the north, rocket and missile fire and drone fires and drone infiltrations as well.
And when you look at the 8 months of hostility between Israel and Hezbollah to the north of Israel, between Israel and southern Lebanon, it's immense conflict there. It's very heavy, and there's been a lot of fire back across the borders both ways. And in any other circumstance, if Israel wasn't perpetrating a war in Gaza right now, there's no doubt that you would be having full-fledged hostilities. Even though we have elevated hostilities, it's still less than what could be. While Hezbollah is firing mortars and rockets and the anti-tank guided missiles at Israeli positions, both military and civilian, they're not yet using their entire arsenal. Remember, they have between 150 and 200,000 rockets. Many of those are long-range rockets. Many of those are precision-guided rockets. They could blanket the entirety of the Jewish state with rocket and missile fire. They could very likely overrun any Israeli air defenses. And they can also cross the border with more troops than Hamas did on October 7th. So these are very, very real threats, and it's becoming more and more difficult to see how this conflict can cool itself down, put the terrorist genie back in the bottle, so to speak. It seems very, very clear that this next front is going to take place. It's already taking place, and it's going to take place in a big way soon. The question is, how quickly can Israel finish up in Rafah and Gaza? You see that Israel continues to cycle back through areas in Gaza that it had already taken. When will they determine that they can keep only a limited fighting force there, so they can move most of the troops, most of the tanks, most of the missile defenses to the north? And also, it seems as though the IDF is waiting and hoping that their new missile defense system, which is a laser-based system, could be fully operational in the coming weeks, hopefully, potentially months. in order to put that into place before Hezbollah would start firing these long-range missiles in order to protect the Israeli home front as much as possible if full hostilities do erupt.
Yeah, that certainly looks like the plan, finishing up with Rafah, the 4 remaining battalions of Hamas, and then turning our attention to the north. But we all know that the head of the snake, or the head of the octopus, if you will, with tentacles of terrorism all over the Middle East, is Iran, with whether it's Hezbollah, or Hamas, the Houthis, and all the other terrorist organizations. And there was a report in Israel Hayom, an exclusive there, in terms of documenting ties between Iran and Russia when it comes to cyber security. Since October 7th, Israel has faced 2.5 to 3-fold a rise in significant cyber attacks. And apparently, to make a long story short here, the Russians now are helping Iran develop their capabilities in order to launch cyber attacks potentially against Israeli infrastructure, perhaps our water system, our roads, technologies, hospitals, and whatnot. And this could be a major, major threat for the state of Israel. Russia in cahoots with Iran. And this is something we're going to have to keep our eye on for the significant period ahead.
Well, cyber is definitely a major component of the war, and it's an underreported component of the war. You'll remember that Israel attacked a nuclear facility in Iran with what was called the Stuxnet virus, changing the speed in which the centrifuge in Iran at a nuclear facility was spinning. Iran has attempted many, many times to attack Israeli infrastructure with cyber. Some of those attempts have been reported, some of them very serious. The IDF working overtime with the whole cybersecurity division to try to repel these attacks. I will tell you that even the JNS.org website has been attacked repeatedly in cyber hacks. Some of them maybe emerging from Iran, some from Russia, some from elsewhere. Many news sites have been attacked repeatedly. And other websites, government websites, hospital websites. You mentioned also, desalination plants in Israel, water systems, electrical systems, natural gas systems, all being attacked by cyber. Now, you talk about the Iran-Russian cooperation, and this emerges, I think, from policies that Israel took. Early on when Russia invaded Ukraine, Israel had wanted to maintain some kind of neutrality in that conflict, providing humanitarian aid, of course, to the Ukrainians on the humanitarian level, but maintaining a sort of political neutrality because Russia operates inside Syria. The other power that operates inside Syria is Iran. Israel wanted to be able to strike inside of Iran, and to do that, they had to have deconfliction mechanisms with the Russians. There was a respect between Israel and Russia. Netanyahu had very strong relations with Putin over many years. And then when Netanyahu was out, Naftali Bennett came into power. He also tried to maintain some degree of neutrality. He actually went to Moscow early on in the war to see if he would be able to negotiate some kind of peace between Russia and Ukraine. It was clear that Bennett was a little bit out of his element and a little bit over his head. I don't believe that Bennett got the respect of Putin, but the foreign minister, Yair Lapid, at that time, he was heavily criticizing Vladimir Putin in that war, and it actually soured the relations between Russia and Israel. And in many ways, it may have pushed or created the opportunity to push Iran into Russia's hands or Russia into Iran's hands. And now we see an axis that's formed, which includes Russia, it includes Iran, it includes China, and they are pushing through the Middle East, and they are an axis that Israel has found itself on the other side of, instead of maintaining some degree of neutrality with Russia, some degree of neutrality with China. And if Iran is backed by Russia and China, they become a much more powerful force than if they were on their own.
And of course, Iran striving for nuclear weapons, and that is the greatest threat to the state of Israel. We will have to keep our eye on that, of course. And also,
Josh, people ask the question. They say, would Iran use nuclear weapons?
Right.
If you look at every dollar that's come into Iran, they use that money to develop nuclear weapons and to fund their terror agencies around the world, which includes Hezbollah, includes Hamas, and includes the Houthis, includes Kataib Hezbollah in Syria. Rather, they use every possible element that they have in order to destabilize the Middle East, and they continuously attack the state of Israel. They've attacked Israel from numerous countries, including directly from Iran themselves, with ballistic missiles. Those ballistic missiles could be footed with nuclear weapons. Okay, we saw these ballistic missiles. Some of them were 20 yards long. They could be fitted with nuclear weapons, and Iran has given no indication whatsoever that if they had nuclear weapons that they would not use them. They would use them, and they talk about death to Israel. They talk about death to America. That threat has to be taken very, very seriously. It is an existential threat to the Jewish state if Iran would have deliverable nuclear weapons. Israel was given an opportunity to attack some of those nuclear facilities the night after Iran struck Israel with ballistic and cruise missiles. Israel didn't take it. It seems as though Iran continues to march toward nuclear weapons, and it's a big question as to when Israel or the United States will do what's necessary in order to make sure that Iran does not become a fully deliverable nuclear power.
And I think people must keep in mind that Iran views Israel as the little Satan and views the United States and the Western world as the great Satan. So don't think it just ends here with the Jewish state. This is a threat to Western humanity. And obviously Israel is going to have to, if necessary, with our fingernails, go at it alone if that's what it takes. That's going to do it for today. Alex, will we see you, please God, back in studio next week?
Looking forward to being back with you in the eternal homeland of the Jewish people, the capital of the only country, which is the state of Israel, and no other country, back in Jerusalem next week, Josh.
Amen to that. Have a successful rest of your trip. Have a safe flight back. And please God, we will see you here in the beautiful JNS studios in the heart of Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, next week. I want to say thank you so much to Ryan Lifshitz, everything he does behind the scenes here at JNS, making these broadcasts possible. Don't forget, go to YouTube, go to JNS TV for all of the latest amazing content from Israel, everything you have to know about what's going on here in the Jewish state. Also go to jns.org for the latest coverage of everything taking place in Israel and the Middle East. My name is Josh Hasten, along with Alex Traiman. Continue to pray for our brave men and women of the IDF. Let's bring home the hostages. And have a great week. Have a safe week, everybody. Shalom.